Good afternoon, and welcome to our June webinar, a collaborative presentation of the Federation for Children with Special Needs and the Recruitment, Training, and Support Center. My name is Janie Kreco, and I am the Training and Support Specialist at RTSC. Our technical producers today are Danielle Harden, Sonia Ford, and John Sullivan. Today's webinar is the role of occupational therapy in supporting children who have experienced trauma, presented by Andrea Fairman. Dr. Fairman is Associate Professor of Occupational Therapy in the School of Health and Rehabilitation at the Massachusetts General Hospital Institute of Health Professionals. Dr. Fairman began her career working in human services and community mental health before she became an occupational therapist. She was one of the first 100 persons in the world to take the certification exam to become a certified psychiatric rehabilitation practitioner, CPRP. She is also certified as a behavioral specialist consultant and has worked extensively with persons who have developmental and psychiatric disabilities. Her philosophy is that, quote, the best lessons are acquired from applying information to real-life situations and learning from interactions with others. During the webinar, please type your questions in the toolbox and feel free to engage with other attendees. We will leave time at the end of the hour to address the questions, and I also believe that Andrea has some times that she has put into the PowerPoint so that you can ask questions also. If your question is not answered live, please send us an email and we will do our best to follow up with you. If you are interested in learning more about the Federation, please go to our website at www.fcsn.org and explore all the different programs, including how to volunteer to become a special education surrogate parent or attend one of the many trainings presented by the Parent Training Information Center. Very excited to present Dr. Andrea Fairman. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Janie. I appreciate this opportunity. I considered that this is a sort of a unique topic in many ways, and that perhaps a lot of people wondered why we are including occupational therapy in combination with trauma. And in fact, many occupational therapists work with persons who have mental health issues. And some folks are not aware of that. In fact, occupational therapy actually evolved from psychiatric services. So we are working on getting back to our roots, and those of us that work in mental health are really trying to champion that for occupational therapy. I would like to say before I start that very little of this presentation is actually my doing. 4 of the students who attend our OTD program at MGH, Institute of Health Professions, have contributed to this presentation, have done all the research, and I am including them in videos because they are actually out on their clinicals now and not able to be here for the webinar. So I will start with just sort of a brief introduction of occupational therapy and how occupational therapy helps individuals despite their age, despite their condition, and in many different settings. So a lot of people don't realize that occupational therapists actually can work in forensic settings or in homeless centers. What is probably often more commonly understood is that occupational therapists work with persons with disabilities. And those disabilities could be things from developmental disabilities like cerebral palsy or spina bifida, or individuals who have acquired disabilities like a spinal cord injury or maybe have experienced a stroke. But for those of you who are not as familiar with the wealth that occupational therapy has to offer, I just wanted to share this website so that you could see a little bit more about that. And my understanding is that there are quite a few clinicians on today, and probably quite a few occupational therapists who are more familiar with that. So, as I mentioned, we are going to break this into 4 parts for the 4 different students who helped create this presentation. First, we'll start with a general background that looks at the overall impact of trauma. And it's interesting to note that trauma not only impacts the psychological well-being of individuals, but also impacts the physical health and well-being of individuals for their entire life. So, some research has been done. It's actually called the ACEs study, which Ellie will share a little bit more detail in a moment, that identified that individuals who had experienced trauma as children were twice as likely to have poor health outcomes as adults. And these include things like congestive heart failure and diabetes. So the trauma can be associated with a lifelong journey in trying to maintain health and wellness. The second component that we're going to look at is a process of the intervention. And the first step in that is really creating a secure attachment to an adult figure in that child's life. And I have another student whose name is Bridget who will be sharing that information. Next, we will look at mindfulness as another way of promoting well-being for individuals who have experienced trauma. And in this brief section, Claire will share her aspects of the presentation and actually do a demonstration of deep breathing techniques and a variety of other strategies. And then finally, what many folks do actually recognize as being associated with occupational therapy practice is sensory-based strategies. And many children who have experienced trauma have difficulties with processing sensory input, either hypersensitive or hyposensitive. And during this section of the presentation, Marissa will share information around that. So again, I shared information about each of the students, and Jeannie's already given a nice overview as to my background. I won't go into that. As I mentioned, we will pause for just a brief moment between each of these sections so that if you do have questions related to that particular area, please feel free to send those in and we'll stop. Then we will move on to the next section, and then at the very end we'll have a final Q&A. So the first component is the global impact of trauma, and I'm going to share with you a video created by Ellie.
Hi, my name's Ellie Wheeler. I'm an occupational therapy student at the Institute, and I'm going to talk to you about the global impact of trauma today. Just to give you a little background about myself, I am focusing my doctoral project primarily on children who are experiencing toxic stress, and particularly those within the homeless population. So, what is stress? Stress is something that we all experience, and there are different forms of stress. And stress can either help us by helping us learn how to adapt to situations and develop healthy coping mechanisms, or it can hurt us. So positive stress is brief and small, and it allows you to practice adaptive responses that will help you further in life when stressful situations occur. So this might be when a child goes to school for the first time, or when getting shots. And then there's tolerable stress, and that's when a child is exposed to an experience that isn't necessarily normal, but if they have a positive relationship with an adult who can respond and help them learn how to cope, they can learn a coping mechanism for events such as a death within the family or an illness that is more than your common cold. And then there's toxic stress, which is what we will primarily be focused on today. Toxic stress is when trauma is cumulative, chronic, and when the child lacks adult support. It occurs when adverse childhood experiences such as abuse, homelessness, parents who have an alcohol or drug addiction, economic hardship, things like that. When that's paired with a loss of power and control felt by the child will develop toxic stress. So feelings of powerlessness and loss of control can prolong the activation of the stress response system. So short bursts of the stress response system is healthy, such as in the positive stress. When it's prolonged for a long time, this can have damaging cognitive and physical effects on the child. If a child is experiencing toxic stress, their system will be overly active and slow to shut down. So this just makes it more likely that they will stay in the stress response system for long after the stressful experience has occurred, and it will be activated more quickly again in future situations. So how does toxic stress affect the child? Well, it's all dependent on the stage of brain development. So if toxic stress, if the event's occurring in prenatal times or early in life, that's when it has its broadest range of effects because of the rapid brain development that's occurring at this time. Throughout later childhood and adolescence, the effects of toxic stress become more specific and difficult. You usually see it with like difficulty in attention, kids are impulsive, and they lack the ability to regulate their emotions. And then later into adolescence and early adulthood, you might see it as a heightened fear response or reactivity to stressful stimuli, even if there is no threat actually occurring. And also in late adolescence and early adulthood, and even into later adulthood, you might see the manifestation in physical ways, which I'll discuss in a little bit. So the specific effects on the child. So toxic stress in particular is going to affect, primarily you're going to see it in their occupations such as school, their schoolwork, their ability to interact with their peers, their ability to interact with their family members. So play's affected and school's affected, and those are the two primary things that a child needs to be able to do in order to develop. So this, you might see this with poor language abilities. They have difficulties with memory, particularly long-term memory, a heightened fear response and reactivity. So again, that fear response when no threat might actually be occurring, and that's hard, especially in social situations. And then it can lead to special education placements, grade retention, low test scores, and a lack of attendance in school. And then so toxic stress, the effects of it are going to stay with the child for life. So in adulthood, you might see it as there's a higher risk of school failure. They've seen a higher risk of incarceration and economic dependency. So toxic stress can also add to the expense of our healthcare system. There are a variety of conditions that you might see as an adult that are because a child experienced toxic stress previously. So things like type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, hypertension, cancer, respiratory issues, arthritis, addiction. These are all correlated with having toxic stress. So it might be that the person was, that was the physical path they were headed down to begin with, but it also might be a result of the toxic stress. So this is going to add not only an expense for them and possibly a shorter life, but also the expense of healthcare for our system in general. The effects of toxic stress can be both on a personal level and a wide-reaching population level.
All right, so let's stop a little bit for some question and answers, if there are any that have been posted.
Yes, so this is the point at which if you have any questions about what was just the little video we just watched, you can type them in at this time, or you can wait until we get a little bit farther, but this is going to be a little question and answer period, and I will let Andrea know what the questions are. So just a couple of seconds for you to type in any questions. If I don't see any right away, we will move on to the next session of it, and you can answer your questions later. So I think people are just getting into it, Andrea, so why don't you go ahead and we will continue.
Sure. We'll stop 2 more times.
Oh, wait a minute, hold on. I spoke too soon. Is there a published study where we could find the correlations between, I think they're referring to the ACE study. Mm-hmm. So you can go ahead and speak to that, or I can. It's up to you.
Yes. The ACEs study is the long-term longitudinal study that was conducted and does show all these correlations, and it's quite surprising. There's a great video that you can watch on a TED Talk. So if you type in ACEs into the TED search site, you'll see a great overview of that. And of course, there's also a lot of literature out there on it. At the end of this presentation, there are references listed as well.
And also what I can do is send out a handout of the trauma resources that we give out during our presentations at the Federation on Trauma and Learning. Okay? All right. ACE, no, they're asking how to spell it. It's ACES, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study.
Yes.
It's not ASIS, but that's a great question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll move on to the next section then. So the second component, as I previously mentioned, is related to how we begin interventions for children who have experienced trauma. And Bridget McNamara, OT student at our program, has put together a nice video presentation to give an overview of that.
Into working with kids who've experienced trauma at a summer camp that works with different children with emotional, behavior, and social difficulties. And I've also spent a year working at an emergency shelter for children who had been taken from their homes due to abuse or neglect. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about attachment and trauma. What is attachment? So attachment is an emotional bond that's formed between two people. Attachments made in childhood have an impact on relationships all throughout their life. And attachment is important because it allows children to feel protected and safe, and it provides a secure base for a child to safely explore their environment. Healthy attachment also provides support for a child when they feel overwhelmed by their environment and gives them a safe place to come back to. It helps them have the confidence to try new things, and it can have a strong impact on their behavior, either positively or negatively. It can also impact play skills, school performance, emotional regulation, self-esteem, connection to peers and other adults, and future relationships. Children who experience trauma often have difficulty developing these healthy attachments to caregivers due to the nature of abuse or neglect, which is typically from their primary caregiver, and then also being moved around multiple times. Makes it difficult for them to have that consistent interaction with the same caregivers and build that positive bond. So what are some things that we can do to promote a healthy attachment? One thing is creating a consistent, predictable, and responsive environment. A predictable routine can help this child, or can help do this. So it can help the child feel more in control, which is something that they can lose after they experiencing trauma. Being able to predict what's going to happen next helps provide structure and can help the child get through these challenging transitional times, such as a morning getting ready before school, or nighttime getting ready for bed and sleep. So having a consistent morning routine helps the child know what's expected of them and be more able to meet those expectations. It can help the day run more smoothly, and having a consistent nighttime routine can also help with sleep, which also has a huge impact on behavior. Creating a supportive, reliable, responsive environment also has a lot to do with how the caregiver responds to different behaviors. So having clearly established rules and expectations helps the child know what is expected and therefore be more likely to meet those expectations. When a child is able to meet these expectations and follow these rules, it's really important to give them that positive feedback and praise as soon as they do it. So you're catching them doing something right and giving them that specific constructive feedback. You can also use play skills to promote attachment. So play skills are things like being able to share toys and take turns, engaging in games with different types of rules, and coming up with creative ways to engage with their surroundings. Children who've experienced trauma often struggle with peer interaction and with these various play skills. So having the caregiver play with the child helps promote these play skills and helps give that positive interaction between the caregiver and the child to help strengthen that bond. The OT can also help the caregiver engage in guided play, which includes modeling the correct play skills and other various strategies, while simultaneously strengthening the connection between the caregiver and the child. Another aspect of promoting healthy attachment is how the caregiver actually reacts to the child's behavior. So often when a child has strong emotions, it can be difficult to deal with, but it's important to check your own response to these strong emotions and try to determine the need that's behind this extreme behavior. So oftentimes if there's a reason for the child acting the way that they are. So sometimes, say if a task is too challenging for a child, they might react with causing a disruption, such as acting up or trying to distract from the fact that they find this task too challenging. So one thing that you can do is, instead of forcing them to do the activity and thinking that they just want to be defiant, understanding that it might be challenging for them and adjusting the task so they are able to engage more successfully in this task. OTs have training in activity demands and breaking down an activity to see where the barriers might be to success for that child. So an OT can help the parent understand how to do that for their child. It's also really important to understand how you are feeling when a child reacts with a difficult behavior. It's very easy to get frustrated or worried or anxious when a child is displaying these challenging behaviors, and it can bring up strong feelings in the caregiver as well. So it's very important for the caregiver to develop strategies to deal with their own feelings. Taking care of yourself is a crucial part of being an understanding and kind caregiver, which also promotes attachment. Later in the presentation, we'll discuss many different calming strategies and sensory strategies for your child, but I encourage you to think about yourself as well and note various strategies that may help you be more present in the moment with your child. Therefore,
Okay, once again, we're going to have the question and answers for this little session of it. So if you have any questions about the attachment piece, just type in your questions and we'll see if we can answer them. And we'll give you a couple seconds this time. Okay. Okay. The audience is very good at attachment. No, if you have any questions that come to you as we continue, just feel free to type them in. Okay, let's keep going, Andrea.
Okay. All right, so our next section is going to look at mindfulness and how we might actually use mindfulness with children to help them be more present in the moment. Many children who have experienced trauma have problems with anxiety and can be caught up in what's going to happen in the future, what has happened in the past. And mindfulness allows us to focus on the present. So Claire actually is going to share with us a variety of different strategies, but we're going to save her demonstration component for the end. So she actually takes you through the process and you can join in with it if you like. But mindfulness is considered to be a spirituality, not necessarily religious in connotation. However, if you do practice religion, mindfulness can be incorporated with those religious beliefs. But mostly, we're thinking about how we can help the individual to be fully present in the moment and understand what's going on with them at that point in time. So one particular strategy is called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And many psychologists as well as occupational therapists use this as a particular strategy, not just for children, but also with adults. And it can be done individually, or it can also be done in small groups. So that oriented attention that is necessary to reduce anxiety and fear, so being able to have the relaxation strategies focused on the present rather than what might happen or what has happened. So when we think about being able to put a person in that state of mind, it allows them to have some tools to be able to cope, and even when the adult or caregiver is not present, the child can actually learn to implement some of these things on their own. So why do mindfulness? So as was previously mentioned, it's not just for children, it's for adults too. So what is often frustrating for adults and children who have behavioral issues is being reactive, as Bridget mentioned in her section, and how we can actually think about what's going on in that situation rather than the snowball effect that can happen. So things build up throughout the day, and then a child has a meltdown, and then you have a meltdown. But how we can actually look at what's going on in that given moment in that situation and be more mindful or rational about it to be able to understand the underlying problems. So rather than reading the slides, I'm just going to try to give you a little bit of an overview so we can get a little bit caught up on time too. So who should engage in mindfulness? Basically everyone is what Claire has added here. It's not just good for the kids, but also good for the professionals, good for the parents. It's a strategy that sometimes people refer to as meditation, but really has some additional techniques, and Claire is going to share some of those with you in her demonstration. So it really can happen anywhere. You don't need a special location for it. Oftentimes all you need is just a quiet space. And children should have a space in their home that they can identify as their sort of timeout area, not necessarily for punishment, but a timeout area to be able to go to and relax and feel safe. A lot of kids enjoy having a little tent or a cave sort of thing that they've built with blankets or under a table that has that sort of safety zone for them. And they know that that's where they can go relax and feel safe. So as I mentioned, Claire is going to give us some breathing exercises, and you can feel free to join in with these as she does a nice job with the demonstration.
So the question, when should I start practicing mindfulness? The answer is now. So I'm going to invite you all to do some breathing exercises with me. And we're going to start first with a 4-count deep belly breathing. So oftentimes when we're stressed, we do these shallow chest breaths. And instead, I want to invite you all to do a belly breath that can really reduce your stress and anxiety when you're feeling anxious. So at first, I ask you all to just place your hands at your stomach, and you can interlace them, you can have them one on top of the other, but just put your hands at your stomach so you can start to bring awareness to the belly breath. So what I invite you to do is to inhale through your nostrils for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, exhale for a count of 4, and then inhale for a count of 4. So we're going to do that together. So we're going to inhale through our nostrils, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, exhale, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. And you can start doing that breath cycle over and over again until you calm yourself down or until you enter a mindful state. You can do this for as long or as little as you like. This can be done with all ages. One way to use this type of breathing with children is to use a breath rock or a breathing rock. Sometimes they're called belly buddies. But it's just a personalized rock for a child to use to start to bring awareness to their breath too. So what you can do is invite the child to lay down on the ground, place the rock on their stomach, and this pressure of the weight of the rock allows a little bit of pressure on the stomach so they can start to hone in on that feeling and really bring awareness to their stomach and their breath. You can play music while they're breathing. You can have it be silent. You can open the windows and listen to the sounds outside. But really this rock is just a way for them to focus in and bring awareness to their belly, their body, their breathing. Sometimes they might fidget around, take it off, play with it, but it's just a way, an introductory way for them to start bringing awareness to their breath. A more advanced type of breathing that has really been found to reduce stress and anxiety is alternate nostril breathing. So this one is a little bit more intense, but you can work towards it. It's not intense, but a little bit more complicated. So what you do is take your index and your third finger and place them at your brow for stability. You have your thumb and your ring finger closing off either nostril. So first, I invite you to close off your left nostril with your ring finger and inhale through your right nostril. You will close off your right nostril and open your left nostril to exhale. You will inhale through the left nostril, close off the left nostril, and exhale through the right nostril. Inhale, switch, exhale. Inhale, switch, exhale. Inhale, Switch. Exhale. So you can do this repeated alternate breathing exercise in order to ignite your parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest stage, instead of focusing on the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight. So we're calming the body down just by bringing awareness to our breath and awareness to the moment we're in.
And I just want to point out to some of the people that are listening from the Federation, if this sounds familiar, they offer yoga at the Federation once a week, and we are all very good at the breathing. So that's wonderful that we're putting it out there for other people now. So thank Claire for that.
Yeah, she does a really nice job with the demonstration. I don't know that I could give the instructions as clearly as she has with the right and the left and the breathing. The other option beyond the physical relaxation is that some people respond better to visual stimulation as a relaxation strategy. And the glitter jar, which you see depicted here, allows for the child to be able to focus on watching the glitter settle. And it really can be something as simple as a water bottle that's filled with glitter and perhaps some beads and things like that. And the amount of the consistency of whatever fluid it is that you decide to use can change the speed of it. So if you wanted to go very slowly, if the child has difficulty relaxing over a longer period of time, you might want to use a thicker fluid, for instance, hand soap or oil. Whereas if it seems that the child enjoys to have the faster stimulation and they like to be able to track it quicker, something that is less thick, like water, would work fine. The child also can customize it so that it's their own creation. It includes stickers and things like that, and it makes them more invested in using it as a tool for calming. So I think that Claire also is sharing some of that.
Let's answer the question, how can I start my mindfulness practice with children? There are various ways you can do this, and you can try some of these today. So the first opportunity I offer you is using the glitter or mindfulness jar. So what this is just a jar. There are different recipes you can find online or in various books, but it's a jar that's filled with glitter, pebbles, beads, rocks, and then liquid. And what you can instruct the child to do is to shake it when they're upset, anxious, overly excited, and then instruct them that this is the mind calming down. As they breathe, the craziness or the anxiety that's in the mind is settling as the glitter settles. And this is when they can start working on their breath. And as the glitter settles, as does the mind. So that's a really fun way to engage the child in their own mindfulness practice. It takes a little bit of arts and crafts. It takes a little bit of creativity, but it's a really great tool to work with young children. Another option is to do family meditation. That is a great example of that is in this book. I have resources later, but it's Peaceful Piggy's Meditation. It's a great social story for children to read and to learn how to engage in meditation and have a great fun read along the way. So that Peaceful Piggy Meditation was one of the books I just showed you. These are books that you can find at your local library. Moody Cow Meditates is another great resource that talks about the mindfulness or the glitter jar, and really can teach the child how to incorporate that into their day-to-day life using a story. A Handful of Quiet is a pebble meditation where you can kind of transform that breathing exercise I showed you earlier using that rock and start to bring an intention or a purpose to that rock. So every time you revisit that rock, you can think of a certain area in your life that you want to focus on. And then planting seeds, practicing mindfulness with children is a great tool for adults to use when they're working with children and they want to incorporate mindfulness strategies into their life. So some last words I want to leave you with about mindfulness. This last quote has something that has resonated with me for a long time, and I find particularly meaningful and really wish to share with you all. It is important to be aware of our thoughts so that we can guide them in the direction we want to go rather than being guided by them. I thank you all for listening today, and I hope that you may bring some of these strategies back into your daily life. Thank you.
Okay, and we have one more section that will be going over sensory strategies, and Marissa is actually going to be sharing that component with us.
One of the, a question did come in. A couple of them were about the attachment piece that was the previous session. Let's see. Suggestions. So I think that people hopefully understand that attachment disorder is a symptom of trauma, and that all of the strategies that we are talking about would be applicable to any child with an attachment disorder also.
Yes.
And then another question was whether or not there were resources available that you could possibly send to me and I can disseminate for kids who are older. The focus for Claire was on the younger kids, but people are asking, is there anything for older or adolescents?
Adolescents
yes,
and teens?
Yes.
Yeah, we did focus more on the younger children for this particular presentation, but yes, there are actually quite a few, and a lot of the techniques that Claire just demonstrated are appropriate for older children as well as younger children. You don't necessarily have to have the rock or the belly breathing stone or glitter, but the children can use music and things that are more age appropriate for them. But yes, there's quite a bit of literature out there for the older child, even more so than the younger child.
The other question that came in, and I have found this in my own, and it's very well put. Jessie is asking, she said, I'm having trouble finding the correct language to use with schools when supporting students with complex trauma. I am not sure what OT evals to ask for to integrate sensory OT in the student's educational program. It's almost impossible to get support from OT in schools for these kids. Any advice? And I think from my own experience, we're finding that OT and speech and language are not necessarily associated with trauma yet. And you and I had a discussion about this prior to the presentation. Any advice for what teachers or parents can do to make that happen?
So I think one thing to remember is that services that are received in the school setting always have to be attached to the IEP. And if you can show the link between the symptoms that the child has experienced due to trauma that then is affecting or impacting their schoolwork. So for instance, the examples of impact on long-term memory and attention, and how those components of trauma do impact the child's ability to participate in their school, you can have that justified. The other component is that not all services need to happen in the school setting either. So many children can benefit from outpatient therapy, and that can be also delivered in the home setting rather than just looking at school-based rehab services like speech and OT.
And I think one of the things that we are working to do here at the Federation and at MGH is to make schools more trauma-informed, so that they understand that trauma is impacted, there's an impact on many, many parts of the child holistically from trauma. And so we're doing our best to spread that information. Yes, I think we're ready to go forward.
Okay. All right. So our last section is looking at sensory-based strategies to help cope with trauma.
I'm Marissa Capogreco, and I'm an occupational therapy student at the MGH IHP. And my advanced doctoral experience is focused on sensory-based assessments in clinical practice. So today I'm going to give you guys some information on sensory strategies that can be used for children who experience trauma to help them regulate their emotions. So before I give you guys some information on the strategies, I want to give a brief overview on the different sensory system patterns that an individual can be placed in. These are sensory bystander, sensory seeking, sensory sensitivities, and sensory avoiding. These patterns help give an overview on how an individual reacts to different sensory input in the environment. They do not mean that they are bad if you're placed in a certain category. It just helps you see which strategies would work best for you. So a sensory bystander, if you're placed in this category, an individual's typical behaviors are conscientious and focused despite distractions. They're self-absorbed, and it takes time to respond. They find it difficult to get going in the morning. They're casual and easygoing, and they're accommodating and comfortable in most environments. A sensory seeker's typical behaviors are up and active. They're very busy. They're easily excited and animated. They experience change as positive or fun, and they seek a variety of change. They're energetic and creative, and they're a facilitator of change. For sensory sensitives, the child's typical behaviors are cautious or easily affected by environmental factors. They're detail-oriented, and their ability to discriminate and focus on detail. They have a high level of awareness. Their fight or flight response is triggered easily, and they absorb all input. So I starred this slide because children who have experienced trauma often fall under this pattern. The last pattern is sensory avoiders, and their typical behaviors are high awareness to detail and environmental factors. They're good at putting processes and structures together. They prefer procedures and clear expectations in complex environments, and they tolerate and enjoy being alone. And I also started this slide because children who experience trauma often fall under this category as well. So now that you guys have an idea on the different sensory patterns that people can experience, finding the sensory strategy that will help the child better cope with their emotions will make more sense. So the sensory systems that I'm going to focus on today are sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, and movement. So the first one for sight. What can you do? Sight is used for orienting to the environment, and very calming pictures such as nature pictures like sunset, ocean waves, and mountains can allow the individual to feel calm when they're feeling stressed in a certain situation. Projections can also be used, and the glitter jars that Claire had explained previously can also be used as great strategies to help the individuals cope. Touch is the next sensory system, and this can be deciphered into deep pressure touch, which can positively affect an individual's emotions. So things like weighted blankets, beanbag tapping, or simply just giving yourself a self-hug can be great strategies to do when the individual is feeling anxious. Light pressure touch is also something that an individual can do, and this evokes a protective response. So using something such as a brushing protocol with a paintbrush or a feather can help elicit a calming experience for the child. And it's also important to know that when a child's doing these touch strategies, that they're doing them on themselves. Children with trauma particularly are sensitive to these types of strategies, maybe because of past experience with abuse. So it's important that the individual is always doing them on themselves. There's also a technique called emotional tapping that I thought we could watch a video on that can be very helpful to do in the moment. So I have this video that I'm going to show you guys on how to do the particular technique.
Okay, so we're actually going to save that video that you could watch on your own because it's quite lengthy and it'll take us over our time. But I did want to provide an opportunity, again, now that we're at the end of the presentation, for some additional questions and be able to wrap up.
Okay, so we do have a couple of questions that have come in. One of them is about the credentialing of OTs. I don't know too much about this myself, and I don't know whether schools have changed the credentialing that are required in schools. And it's also, I think that we should address the idea of the trauma sensitivity of OTs. The kids that you are working with are just now going into the community, right? So they're just graduating. and whether or not that's a new trend, and do you know if other OTs are being trained in trauma also?
So all occupational therapy students receive training in psychosocial components of healthcare, and that includes everything from serious mental illness to folks who have experienced anxiety or OCD, so the full gamut of mental health training that is provided to healthcare professionals is also included in occupational therapy curriculums, and probably more so than many other rehab professions, because occupational therapists work with many persons with mental health diagnoses. And in fact, I've had people in the past say to me, I don't want to work in mental health. And I said, well, do you want to work with people? If you want to work with people, you're working in mental health. So there are several courses in the OT curriculum that are dedicated to helping individuals with psychiatric or psychosocial conditions, including both individual and group dynamics, which is a huge component of that, because many services in community mental health settings as well as inpatient mental health settings are delivered in a group format rather than a one-on-one basis. So OTs are, in the state of Massachusetts, recognized as licensed mental health professional. All OTs need to obtain a license for their state, so it can vary from state to state. And as we were talking a little bit before it started, Janie, my decision to get my certification in psychiatric rehabilitation at that point in time in my career was because in the state of Pennsylvania in 2001, so I'm dating myself, OTs were not necessarily recognized as licensed mental health professionals. However, the ACODE standards, which is our accrediting body for all of our educational programs, requires that mental health training be provided to students and that they also get an experiential component, which is referred to as fieldwork. And that fieldwork can be in any number of settings that would have a mental health population, which could be from a homeless center to an inpatient psychiatric unit. And OTs receive that as part of their training.
So do the fact that all OTs are licensed mental health clinicians, is that something new in Massachusetts, or is it new? Has that always been true?
It has always been true, but as those who work in mental health probably realize that sometimes working in the mental health sector is not as attractive as working in the physical health sector because of pay rates and so on. And a lot of OTs choose not to work in mental health for these reasons, as well as other professions do too. So.
Okay, that's very interesting. I didn't realize that.
I think that we'll see some big changes. There's actually some policy that's perhaps going to go through with the change in presidency. We'll see what happens, but they're looking at making mental health services being an area that student loan forgiveness will be provided for occupational therapists, and that will really change how many OT students choose to go and practice in mental health versus other settings.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there is, I hear from people that are in the field that OT and speech and language now is getting harder and harder to find people that can do that in the community. They have to do it in the schools, but in the community it's getting harder and harder, especially with the qualifications that they will work with mental health issues. Okay, so anybody else have any questions? We do have a little bit of time. Please bring them on. Andrea must leave right at 1:30 because she has a busy schedule, so if you have any questions at all, please type them in. We'll give you a couple of minutes. One of the things that is very interesting to me in my experience with the Federation is writing OT goals on IEPs. I imagine that in most situations the OT will write their own goals for the IEP, and they can make them trauma-based, right? Mm-hmm. Including any kind of sensory work.
Mm-hmm. So the trick to that obviously is that an IEP goal has to be connected to the IEP, right? So we can't have just goals that are associated with coping and calming strategies unless it shows how that is helping the child achieve academically. Mm-hmm. And that's a really key component. So a lot of times you see OT goals in IEPs that are focused more on things like handwriting, mm-hmm. Or being able to pay attention in class. However, if we think about this, because trauma can affect a child's cognitive ability and their ability to maintain strain their attention or maybe become overreactive in certain situations that can take away from their ability to learn. If we can connect that and make that clear in the goals, it is in fact woven into the IEP.
Right, and we at the Federation always say to make sure that the student is able to access the general curriculum and the life of the school, because that's the federal law. Okay, so let's see, we do have a few questions here. Okay, so this is an interesting one. They're asking about students with intellectual disabilities rather than emotional disabilities. Do they have the same great response for kids with intellectual disabilities? Any kind of OT work that you've describing, like the glitter jar?
Oh, absolutely. So a lot of these sensory strategies work for children with all types of behavioral needs. Children with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities that might impact their cognitive ability may not be able to use the more in-depth strategies like mindfulness because of lack of self-awareness in certain instances, but a lot of the sensory-based strategies that just focus on the input can very much so serve to help calm a child, and eventually that they can use those as self-calming strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Also, I know that it's been my experience that if parents or teachers or anybody involved with students in schools ask for sensory integration, that the schools will say that there's something about sensory integration not being diagnosable or something. Can you speak to that? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Sure. So it's actually called sensory processing disorder, and it is in the DSM-5 now.
It is.
It is. So the new version of the DSM actually does include sensory processing disorder, and also sensory has become part of the component of diagnosis of autism. So that certainly is changing how sensory-based strategies are used. Sensory integration is a very specific technique that an OT must go and get certified for.
Okay.
But many OTs do have in their curriculum training in sensory modulation, which is using sensory-based strategies, not necessarily a pure SI technique or sensory integration technique, because that requires certification.
Okay. So what was that diagnosis again?
Sensory processing disorder.
So sensory processing disorder. You wouldn't happen to remember the number, do you? Of the?
I do not.
Okay.
But you often see it as SPD. The acronym is often used.
SPD. So that's a great way to bring. That's great to bring to the IEP meeting. Is that they have a sensory. I suppose they'd have to have the diagnosis of it given to them, but certainly kids with trauma would have that. Many of them will have that diagnosis.
And Marissa doesn't mention this in her section, but there are basic assessments that can be provided. Many of them are reports from teachers and or parents about how a child processes their surroundings and or input. The sensory profile is one that's commonly used and has a component for children over the age of 14 do their own, and actually as early as 12, depending on the child's ability. And there's a component that the teacher can fill out if we're trying to incorporate this into the IEP, and then of course the parent or caregiver, because they often know the child the very best.
Okay, so that's what they're asking is what are the evals called? So it's say that. Can you say it again?
The sensory profile.
The sensory profile.
Is a common one.
Okay.
It's created by Winnie Dunn.
Winnie Dunn. All right, great. Some people are disputing that SPD is a formal diagnosis.
There's people always disputing.
Okay.
And I suppose that's always going to be the case, and that there is a emerging literature showing that these techniques are successful. Certainly more research needs to be done, but those persons who have worked with many children with trauma and or autism or other conditions that are associated with sensory processing disorders know that the power that using some of these techniques and strategies can have for them.
All right, so just to remind everybody out there, you do not have to have a diagnosis to get services on an IEP. You simply have to show that the student cannot access the curriculum and the life of the school, and that they have issues doing that because of a certain disability, whether it's emotional, social, or intellectual, or a learning disability. I know that's a kind of a switch of thinking recently, but it is true, as long as it impacts learning. And that's, if that point can be made, then the child is eligible for an IEP. All right, so we got, okay, so Sarah Sawyer, hi, I'm going to use your name. You're the clinical director at the Kumar Center, which you probably know about in Watertown, maybe not.
I'm fairly new to the New England area,
okay.
having come from Pittsburgh, but I think I have heard of it, yes.
Okay, so I have heard of it, and they do not just OT, but I believe they also do speech and language, and she's very excited by your work, but she says that she's pretty sure that the SPD is not yet a formal diagnosis. So I'm not going to get into the middle of this because I don't know myself, but maybe you and Sarah can talk.
For billing and those kinds of things, yes, she is correct.
Okay, here you go.
So if you're trying to send it into medical assistance or something like that, you're not going to use SPD as a diagnosis.
All right, so that's it. For medical, that's probably a very important thing, that it's not a diagnosis that's billable yet. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people have to do, is make sure it's billable. But not so much at the schools. And we can go into the whole talk about using Mass Health in schools. You don't have to do that, but some schools try to. Anyway, I think we're just about out of time. We have a couple of more minutes. If you've got any pressing questions, please type them in right now. So that Andrea can get on her way. She has to get down to the Navy Yard in Charlestown.
Yes, that's
and she walked, so
it's a beautiful day for walking.
It is a beautiful day for walking, yes. So one last opportunity to ask questions. And thank you everyone for attending. There's been a great response. Many people on the webinar today. It will be available on our archive. So those of you who had to leave or were having trouble, staying focused on it, it will be available immediately. The PowerPoint will be available immediately, and then the one that is accessible will be within a couple of weeks. And everyone is saying thank you very, very much, Andrea, for being here. And thank you all.
I have one more part to share with you because the students couldn't be here. They wanted to give a little thank you as well. Let me just switch the sound
Thank you for joining us.